June 4, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Pacific Ocean, 180 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey stands on the flight deck of USS Enterprise, watching his dive bomber crews complete their pre-flight checks in the pre-dawn darkness. The steel deck beneath his feet vibrates with the rhythmic pulse of the carrier's engines as she cuts through calm seas at 25 knots. McCluskey checks his watch. 0430 hours. In exactly 11 minutes, the first aircraft will launch into the darkness, beginning what intelligence officers believe will be the most critical carrier battle of the Pacific War. His squadron commanders have already briefed their pilots on the expected enemy position. A Japanese carrier task force commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same officer whose aircraft had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. But what McCluskey doesn't know, what no American commander fully understands in this moment, is that the Japanese pilots preparing for their own dawn launch are operating under assumptions that will prove catastrophically wrong. They believe American carriers are still hundreds of miles away, beyond striking range. They believe their own reconnaissance aircraft have provided adequate warning of enemy movements. They believe the doctrine that guided them to victory after victory across the Pacific remains valid. In the next 11 minutes, USS Enterprise will begin launching 216 aircraft in a coordinated strike that will exploit every weakness in Japanese defensive planning. The Imperial Navy's carrier doctrine, perfected through years of training and validated by 6 months of unbroken victories, is about to collide with an American industrial and tactical response that Japanese war planners never anticipated. The carriers that struck Pearl Harbor are about to discover that the United States Navy they had left burning in Hawaiian waters had transformed itself into something they were unprepared to face. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mission briefing aboard Enterprise had concluded 3 hours earlier, but Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay remained in the ready room, reviewing reconnaissance photographs under the harsh fluorescent lights. As commander of Torpedo Squadron 6, he carried responsibility for 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, aircraft that every pilot in the squadron knew were obsolete, underpowered, and desperately vulnerable to enemy fighters. Lindsay studied the intelligence estimates with the careful attention of a man who understood that American carrier doctrine had been written before the war, based on theoretical calculations rather than combat experience. The Japanese, by contrast, had perfected their tactics through actual operations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Their carrier task forces operated with a coordination and efficiency that American planners could only approximate through careful study of after-action reports from survivors of earlier battles. The tactical problem was straightforward but brutal. American torpedo bombers had to approach enemy carriers at low altitude, maintaining steady course and speed during the final attack run to ensure accurate weapon release. This requirement made them perfect targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The TBD Devastator, with its maximum speed of barely 115 miles per hour during the torpedo approach, gave enemy gunners what amounted to target practice against aircraft that couldn't maneuver defensively. Lieutenant Richard Best, commander of Bombing Squadron 6, entered the ready room carrying the latest weather reports. The dive bomber pilot had flown combat missions since the war's opening days and understood the coordination challenges that faced the striking force preparing to launch from 3 American carriers. Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet together could put nearly 250 aircraft into the air, but coordinating their attacks against a moving enemy fleet required timing and communication that had never been successfully executed in combat. Wade's planning to circle the strike group until everyone's airborne, Best informed Lindsay, referring to Commander McCluskey's role as Air Group Commander. Could take 45 minutes to get everyone formed up and headed toward the target. The implications were significant. Every minute spent circling and organizing gave the Japanese more time to maneuver, more opportunity for their reconnaissance aircraft to locate the American carriers, more chance that the entire strike would arrive at empty ocean because the enemy had moved beyond the estimated position. Lindsay nodded slowly, his expression revealing the calculations every squadron commander was making in these final hours before launch. The American carriers had achieved complete surprise. Japanese reconnaissance efforts had failed to locate the American task force, giving Admiral Raymond Spruance an advantage that wouldn't last once American aircraft appeared in the skies over the enemy fleet. But surprise alone wouldn't sink carriers. That required coordinated attacks by torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, all arriving simultaneously to overwhelm Japanese defensive capabilities. The doctrine was sound, in theory. Torpedo bombers attacking at low altitude would force Japanese fighters down to wave height, leaving the sky clear for dive bombers plunging from 15,000 feet with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. American fighters would engage enemy combat air patrol, preventing them from intercepting the attacking bombers. 3 carriers launching coordinated strikes should put enough aircraft over the enemy fleet to saturate their defenses and achieve the multiple hits needed to disable or sink Japanese carriers. But theory assumed perfect coordination, reliable communications, and aircraft that arrived at the target simultaneously from multiple directions. Combat experience from the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier had proven that such coordination was extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Radio communications were unreliable at the distances involved. Weather conditions could separate formations. Different aircraft types flew at different speeds and altitudes, making it nearly impossible to maintain cohesion during long-range strikes. Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's torpedo squadron, had made his concerns explicit during the previous evening's briefing. His 15 Devastators would be launching without fighter escort, relying entirely on speed and surprise to reach their targets before Japanese fighters could intercept them. Waldron understood the mathematics of the situation better than most. Torpedo bombers approaching without fighter cover faced astronomical loss rates, but American carrier doctrine insisted that splitting fighter strength to escort torpedo attacks weakened the overall strike coordination. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Gay, the youngest pilot in Waldron's squadron, had listened to his commander's briefing with the careful attention of someone who recognized that survival might depend on understanding tactical realities rather than doctrine. Gay knew that the TBD Devastator had been designed in 1934, an eternity in aviation technology. Japanese Zero fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who averaged 600 hours of combat experience. American replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific often had fewer than 300 total flight hours. The industrial capacity that would eventually overwhelm Japanese resistance had not yet fully mobilized in early 1942. American shipyards were building carriers at a pace that would produce 50 by war's end, but in June of 1942, the United States Navy could field exactly 3 operational carriers in the Pacific. The Japanese combined fleet operated 6 fleet carriers, plus numerous light carriers, giving them numerical superiority that would persist for another 18 months. But numbers told only part of the story. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized offensive action, coordinated strikes, and the concentration of force at decisive points. Their pilots had trained together for years, practicing the coordinated attacks that had devastated Allied forces from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. The Kido Butai, the carrier strike force commanded by Admiral Nagumo, represented the most experienced and capable naval aviation force in the world. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, commanding Bombing Squadron 3 aboard Yorktown, understood that American advantages lay not in experience or equipment quality, but in intelligence and timing. Navy cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with precise information about enemy intentions and composition. Nimitz knew that Nagumo's carriers would strike Midway at dawn, and he had positioned his carriers to launch a counterstrike while Japanese aircraft were still armed and fueled on their hangar decks. The intelligence breakthrough represented a strategic advantage of immense value, but Leslie recognized that intelligence alone couldn't sink carriers. That required pilots willing to press home attacks against overwhelming defensive fire, aircraft that could survive long enough to deliver their weapons, and coordination that maximized the striking power of limited American resources. On Enterprise's flight deck, aviation ordnancemen completed the delicate work of arming aircraft with torpedoes, bombs, and ammunition. Each SBD Dauntless dive bomber carried a single 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, a weapon specifically designed to penetrate carrier flight decks and detonate in the hangar spaces. Below, the Mark 13 torpedoes loaded onto TBD Devastators were less reliable, with a failure rate that approached 50%. American torpedo design lagged significantly behind Japanese long-lance torpedoes, which were faster, more reliable, and carried larger warheads. The material disadvantages facing American forces in June of 1942 reflected industrial priorities that had emphasized peacetime economy over military preparation. Japanese carriers had been designed and built with the explicit purpose of projecting power across the Pacific. American carriers represented compromises between treaty limitations, budget constraints, and the Navy's divided attention between Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Commander McCluskey completed his final walk-around inspection of his SBD Dauntless, checking control surfaces, examining the bomb mounting, and reviewing the navigation plot one last time. As Air Group Commander, he would lead 33 dive bombers from Enterprise in the coordinated strike, but he understood that leadership in this battle would require more than tactical skill. The success or failure of the American counterstrike depended on decisions made in the next few hours, decisions based on incomplete information and executed under combat conditions that no American carrier pilot had previously experienced. The Japanese carriers preparing to recover their Midway strike force operated under assumptions that shaped every aspect of their defensive preparations. Admiral Nagumo's staff had calculated that American carriers, if present in the area at all, remained at least 200 miles distant. This estimate was based on the absence of any American reconnaissance contacts and the presumption that American carrier operations followed predictable patterns. Japanese combat air patrol consisted of approximately 40 Zero fighters orbiting above the carrier task force at various altitudes. These aircraft were positioned to intercept high-altitude bombers approaching from expected directions, based on doctrine that emphasized defense against coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft types. The Zeros were flown by pilots who had trained for years in carrier operations and had accumulated combat experience across the Pacific War's opening months. But Japanese defensive doctrine contained a critical vulnerability that American planners had identified through careful analysis of earlier battles. Zero fighters operating as combat air patrol consumed fuel at high rates, requiring regular returns to their carriers for refueling and rearming. This rotation meant that the number of fighters actually airborne at any given moment was significantly less than the total fighter complement available to the carrier force. Timing an attack to coincide with fighter rotation could reduce defensive coverage at the critical moment. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, supervised the recovery of aircraft returning from the Midway strike with the practiced efficiency that characterized Japanese carrier operations. His crews had perfected the complex choreography of landing, refueling, and rearming aircraft, with a speed that American carriers would not match until late in the war. Japanese doctrine emphasized rapid turnaround times that allowed carriers to launch multiple strikes in quick succession, maintaining offensive pressure against enemy forces. The aircraft returning from Midway reported successful attacks on American installations, but recommended a second strike to complete the suppression of the atoll's defenses. This recommendation created a tactical dilemma that would prove decisive. Nagumo's carriers currently had their second-wave aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against enemy ships. Rearming them for a second strike against Midway would require approximately 1 hour, during which time the carriers would be vulnerable to attack. Japanese carrier doctrine addressed this situation through carefully planned rearming procedures that minimized the time when aircraft sat on hangar decks with armed weapons and full fuel tanks. But doctrine assumed that no enemy threat existed within striking range. The absence of American reconnaissance contacts throughout the morning had reinforced this assumption, leading Nagumo's staff to believe they operated with the freedom of action that had characterized previous operations. At 0600 hours, exactly 11 minutes before Enterprise began launching her strike force, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft radioed a report that would shatter every assumption guiding Nagumo's tactical decisions. American ships sighted, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles. The message contained no mention of carriers, leading Nagumo's staff to initially dismiss the contact as cruisers or destroyers rather than a major threat. But 15 minutes later, a follow-up report provided information that transformed the tactical situation. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. The brief message meant that American carriers were not hundreds of miles away as calculated. They were within striking range, potentially already launching attacks against the Japanese task force. The implications cascaded through Nagumo's command structure with the force of a physical blow. If American carriers were present and launching strikes, Japanese carriers needed to launch their own counterstrike immediately. But half of their aircraft were still recovering from the Midway mission, while the second wave aircraft sat on hangar decks armed for ground attack rather than anti-ship operations. Changing the armament load would require the one commodity Nagumo no longer possessed: time. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Midway strike force, radioed his recommendation for a second attack against the atoll just as the reconnaissance report of American carriers reached Nagumo's flagship. The timing created an impossible situation. Launching a second strike against Midway meant leaving American carriers unmolested, allowing them to attack while Japanese aircraft were armed and fueled in vulnerable hangar spaces. But launching an immediate counterstrike against American carriers meant doing so with aircraft armed for ground attack, using weapons ineffective against armored ships. Commander Genda recognized the tactical trap that American positioning had created. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized the concentration of force, launching coordinated strikes with all available aircraft to overwhelm enemy defenses. But concentration required time to arm, fuel, and organize aircraft, time that the proximity of American carriers had eliminated. The alternative was to launch immediate strikes with whatever aircraft were available, abandoning the coordination that Japanese doctrine insisted was essential for success. Nagumo made the decision that doctrine demanded: order all aircraft rearmed for anti-ship operations. Prepare for immediate launch against enemy carriers once rearming is complete. The order sent crews rushing to remove ground attack ordnance and replace it with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, a process that required moving armed weapons through confined hangar spaces while simultaneously refueling aircraft that had just returned from Midway. The scene on Japanese carrier hangar decks became organized chaos as crews worked with desperate efficiency to complete the rearming process. Torpedoes were wheeled from magazines and attached to aircraft. Bombs were transported from storage and loaded onto waiting bombers. Fuel lines snaked across hangar decks as aircraft that had landed nearly empty were filled for the strike against American carriers. Every aspect of the operation represented a calculated risk, trading safety protocols for speed in a race against American aircraft that might already be airborne and approaching. On Enterprise, the first aircraft began launching at exactly 0700 hours. SBD Dauntless dive bombers roared down the flight deck, their engines straining to lift the heavy bombs into the morning sky. The launch sequence proceeded with mechanical precision as aircraft after aircraft catapulted into the air, forming up in squadrons that would comprise the largest coordinated strike force American carriers had yet attempted. Commander McCluskey circled above Enterprise, watching his strike group assemble with the patient determination of a man who understood that every minute spent organizing reduced the chance of achieving surprise. But American carrier doctrine insisted on coordinated attacks, and coordination required time to form up squadrons, establish radio contact, and confirm that all aircraft were airborne and ready to proceed toward the target. The torpedo bombers launched last, their heavy Mark 13 torpedoes requiring maximum deck runs to achieve flight speed. Lieutenant Commander Lindsay led his 14 Devastators into the air, knowing that doctrine assigned his squadron the most dangerous mission: low-altitude torpedo attacks that would draw Japanese defensive fire while dive bombers attacked from above. The TBD Devastators formed up slowly, their obsolete engines struggling to maintain formation speed as McCluskey led the entire strike force toward the estimated enemy position. The formation that departed Enterprise represented the culmination of 6 months of desperate adaptation following Pearl Harbor. American carrier doctrine, written before the war based on theoretical exercises and peacetime training, was being tested against an enemy whose tactical proficiency had been proven in actual combat across half the Pacific Ocean. Commander McCluskey understood that the Japanese carriers his strike force was hunting had devastated Allied forces from Hawaii to Ceylon, operating with a coordination and efficiency that American forces were still struggling to achieve. The navigation challenge was immense. McCluskey had been given an estimated position for the Japanese task force based on the last reconnaissance report, but that information was already 30 minutes old. At the speeds carriers could achieve, 30 minutes meant the enemy could be 15 miles from their estimated position in any direction. Finding 4 carriers in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean required not just navigation skill, but tactical intuition about enemy intentions and maneuvers. Lieutenant Richard Best flew in formation with McCluskey's lead squadron, maintaining the precise spacing that would allow rapid deployment into attack dives once the enemy was located. Best had studied Japanese carrier operations extensively, analyzing after-action reports from every engagement since Pearl Harbor. He understood that Japanese combat air patrol tactics emphasized high-altitude coverage, positioning Zero fighters to intercept bombers, approaching from expected directions at predictable altitudes. But American intelligence had identified a potential weakness in this defensive arrangement. Japanese carriers operating together concentrated their combat air patrol in overlapping patterns that provided mutual protection, but created gaps in coverage when carriers maneuvered independently. If American strikes could exploit these gaps, arriving from unexpected directions or at altitudes where fighter coverage was thinnest, they might achieve the surprise necessary to penetrate defenses and deliver their weapons. The TBD Devastators struggled to maintain formation as the strike force proceeded toward the target area. Lieutenant Commander Lindsay's 14 torpedo bombers flew at their maximum cruise speed of 110 miles per hour, but even this pace strained their obsolete engines. The Devastators had been designed in the mid-1930s, before the rapid advances in aviation technology that characterized the late 1930s and early 1940s. By June of 1942, they were outclassed by every aspect of Japanese defensive capabilities. Lindsay understood the mathematics of his squadron's mission with brutal clarity. Torpedo attacks required steady, level approaches at altitudes below 100 feet, maintaining course for approximately 30 seconds during the final weapon release. This requirement made torpedo bombers nearly stationary targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Historical analysis from earlier battles suggested that torpedo squadrons attacking without adequate fighter escort faced loss rates approaching 75%. Lindsay's 14 aircraft were flying toward an engagement where 10 or more might be shot down before completing their attack runs. The tactical doctrine that sent torpedo bombers into such devastating fire was based on the theory of coordinated attacks. If torpedo bombers forced enemy fighters down to low altitude while simultaneously presenting targets that demanded the attention of anti-aircraft gunners, Dive bombers attacking from high altitude would face reduced defensive fire. The coordination required split-second timing and communications reliability that combat conditions made extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 toward the same target area from a different approach vector, had reached his own conclusions about American carrier doctrine's limitations. His 15 Devastators flew without fighter escort, following a navigation course that Waldron had calculated based on his own tactical instincts rather than the coordinated strike plan. Waldron believed that the estimated enemy position was incorrect and that Japanese carriers had maneuvered north of their reported location. His decision to deviate from the planned course was made without authorization from higher command, a violation of doctrine that reflected Waldron's assessment that rigid adherence to coordinated attack plans was less important than actually locating the enemy. The choice would prove both tragically costly and tactically significant, demonstrating the tensions between doctrine and battlefield reality that characterized American carrier operations in the war's early months. At 0900 hours, Waldron's squadron sighted the Japanese carrier task force exactly where his navigational instincts had predicted. 4 carriers steaming in formation, surrounded by a screen of cruisers and destroyers, their decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The sight confirmed that American intelligence estimates had been accurate about enemy composition and that Japanese carriers were in the vulnerable process of rearming and refueling aircraft for their own strike. Waldron radioed his contact report and immediately began his attack run, understanding that every second of delay gave Japanese fighters more time to intercept his vulnerable torpedo bombers. The 15 Devastators descended to attack altitude, spreading into the line abreast formation that doctrine prescribed for coordinated torpedo attacks. Their slow approach speed and steady course made them perfect targets for the combat air patrol that Japanese carriers had positioned to defend against exactly this type of attack. Zero fighters dove from altitude with the aggressive tactics that characterized Japanese fighter doctrine. The Zeros were flown by pilots who had trained for years in air combat and had accumulated combat experience that few American pilots could match. They attacked Waldron's Devastators with systematic efficiency, making high-speed passes that raked the slow-moving bombers with 20mm cannon and machine gun fire. The TBD Devastators had minimal defensive armament, a single 30-caliber machine gun operated by the radio operator in the rear cockpit. This weapon was nearly useless against fighters, attacking from advantageous positions at high speed. The Devastators' only defense was their formation integrity, hoping that concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft might deter some attackers. But against the experienced Zero pilots of the Kido Butai, formation discipline provided no meaningful protection. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Gay watched as the first Devastator exploded in mid-air, hit by cannon fire that detonated the torpedo still attached to the aircraft. The explosion created a fireball that marked the beginning of a massacre. Within minutes, 8 of Waldron's 15 aircraft had been shot down, their burning wreckage creating smoke columns that marked their final positions. The surviving Devastators pressed their attacks with suicidal determination, maintaining course toward the Japanese carriers despite the devastating defensive fire. Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the American torpedo bombers closed within range, adding their firepower to the Zero fighters already decimating Waldron's squadron. The 5-inch guns on Japanese destroyers created black bursts of flak that filled the sky, while smaller caliber weapons produced streams of tracers that converged on the approaching aircraft. The Devastators flew through this defensive fire with nowhere to maneuver, committed to their attack runs by the torpedo release requirements that demanded steady, level flight. Commander Waldron's aircraft was hit repeatedly, cannon shells tearing through the fuselage and wings. He maintained course long enough to release his torpedo before the Devastator exploded, killing both Waldron and his radio man instantly. The torpedo ran true toward the nearest Japanese carrier, but passed harmlessly astern as the carrier maneuvered at high speed. 14 more devastators pressed their attacks despite the destruction of their squadron leader, each pilot understanding that their only chance of survival was to release their torpedoes and attempt escape at low altitude. The Japanese carriers maneuvered with practiced efficiency, turning hard to port or starboard to present narrow aspects to the approaching torpedoes while maintaining speed that allowed them to outrun the weapons. American Mark 13 torpedoes had a maximum speed of 33 knots, barely faster than the Japanese carrier's top speed of 32 knots. This marginal speed advantage meant that any maneuvering by the target ship could cause the torpedo to miss entirely. Within 15 minutes of beginning their attack, all 15 of Waldron's devastators had been shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket among the burning wreckage while Japanese ships steamed past his position. The complete destruction of Torpedo Squadron 8 had achieved no hits on enemy carriers and had cost the lives of 29 American aircrew. The engagement seemed to validate every criticism of American torpedo doctrine and the obsolescence of the TBD, Devastator. But the sacrifice of Waldron's squadron had accomplished something that would prove decisive. The Zero fighters that had annihilated the torpedo bombers were now at low altitude, their fuel depleted from high-speed combat, many needing to return to their carriers for rearming and refueling. The systematic destruction of the American torpedo attack had drawn Japanese defensive resources down to wave height at the exact moment when Commander McCluskey's dive bombers were approaching from high altitude. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived at the Japanese task force minutes after Waldron's squadron had been destroyed. Lindsay could see the smoke columns marking the final positions of Hornet's torpedo bombers and understood that his own squadron was about to face identical defensive fire. But doctrine demanded that torpedo attacks continue regardless of losses, trusting that the coordination with dive bombers would eventually overwhelm Japanese defenses. Lindsay led his 14 devastators into their attack runs, knowing that Zero fighters were already climbing back to altitude after destroying the previous squadron. The Japanese combat air patrol tactics that had proven so effective against Waldron's aircraft were immediately reapplied against Enterprise's torpedo bombers. Zeros dove from altitude, making high-speed passes that shot down 4 devastators before they could release their torpedoes. The remaining 10 aircraft pressed their attacks with the same determination that had characterized Waldron's squadron, flying through defensive fire that intensified as they closed on the Japanese carriers. Anti-aircraft guns from multiple ships concentrated their fire on the slow-moving bombers, creating a barrage that seemed impossible to penetrate. Lindsay's own aircraft was hit repeatedly, engines smoking and controls damaged, but he maintained course long enough to release his torpedo before the Devastator crashed into the sea. The sacrifice of 2 torpedo squadrons, 29 aircraft destroyed and more than 50 American aircrew killed appeared to achieve nothing. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese carrier. The defensive fire that had annihilated the American attacks seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their combat air patrol doctrine and the superiority of their fighter pilots. On the bridges of Japanese carriers, officers watched the destruction of American torpedo bombers with professional satisfaction, believing that their defensive arrangements had functioned exactly as doctrine prescribed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But at precisely 0920 hours, at an altitude of 15,000 feet directly above the Japanese carrier task force, Commander Wade McCluskey looked down and saw 4 carriers steaming in formation, their decks crowded, with aircraft being prepared for launch. His 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers had arrived at the exact moment when Japanese defensive attention was focused entirely on the torpedo attacks occurring at wave height. The coordination that American doctrine had envisioned was achieved not through careful planning and precise timing, but through the accidental confluence of multiple attack waves arriving independently at nearly the same moment. McCluskey's dive bombers, delayed by the time required to search for the enemy after reaching the incorrect estimated position, had arrived just as the torpedo squadrons were pressing their suicidal attacks. The result was the coordinated assault that doctrine had prescribed, but combat conditions had made almost impossible to execute deliberately. McCluskey signaled the attack with a wing waggle that his squadron commanders recognized instantly. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attack dives in rapid succession, plunging toward the Japanese carriers at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The dive bombing technique required pilots to maintain precise control while descending through 10,000 feet of altitude, compensating for wind drift and target movement while preparing to release their 1,000-pound bombs at the critical moment. Lieutenant Richard Best led Bombing Squadron 6 against the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Best had trained extensively in dive bombing techniques and understood that accuracy depended on maintaining stable dives despite anti-aircraft fire and the physiological effects of high G-forces during pullout. His bomb sight, a simple mechanical device, required the pilot to align crosshairs on the target while compensating for the relative motion of both aircraft and ship. The Japanese carriers attempted evasive maneuvers, turning hard and accelerating to maximum speed in an effort to complicate the bomb aiming calculations. But the SBD Dauntless dive bombers were attacking from an angle and altitude where evasive maneuvers provided minimal defensive benefit. The nearly vertical dive attacks made it difficult for anti-aircraft guns to track targets that were plunging directly toward the ships, and the Zero fighters that had decimated the torpedo squadrons were still at low altitude, unable to climb fast enough to intercept the dive bombers. Best released his 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb at 1,500 feet, pulling out of his dive with a force that pushed him deep into his seat. He rolled away from the carrier and looked back to see his bomb strike Akagi's flight deck slightly aft of amidships, penetrating the wooden deck and detonating in the hangar space below. The explosion created a fireball that erupted through the flight deck, igniting aircraft that were fully fueled and armed with torpedoes and bombs. 2 more bombs struck Akagi within seconds, hitting forward and aft of Best's impact point. The carrier's hangar deck became an inferno as secondary explosions detonated stored ordnance and ruptured fuel lines. The carefully organized rearming operation that had been proceeding on Akagi's hangar deck was transformed into a catastrophe as armed torpedoes and bombs cooked off in the intense heat, creating explosions that tore through the ship's internal structure. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked the carrier Kaga simultaneously, achieving similar devastating results. 3 bombs struck the carrier in quick succession, each penetrating the flight deck and detonating in spaces crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The explosions created a chain reaction of secondary detonations that spread fire throughout Kaga's hangar spaces, overwhelming damage control efforts within minutes. The carrier Soryu received 3 direct hits from Enterprise's 2nd Dive Bomber Squadron, bombs that struck with precision that reflected both pilot skill and the vulnerability of carriers caught with aircraft on their hangar decks. The explosions ignited fuel and ordnance, creating fires that burned with such intensity that crew members could not approach to fight them. Within 10 minutes of the first bomb impacts, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers were burning uncontrollably, their effectiveness as fighting ships destroyed by attacks that had lasted less than 5 minutes. The transformation from Japanese confidence to catastrophic defeat occurred with stunning rapidity. At 09:15 hours, Nagumo's carriers were preparing to launch their own strike against American carriers, their crews working efficiently to complete rearming operations. By 09:25 hours, 3 of his 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their hangar decks transformed into infernos by the explosive interaction of American bombs with Japanese aircraft that were fully armed and fueled. The tactical situation that Japanese doctrine had seriously considered had materialized with devastating effect. American attacks had arrived during the precise window when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, with aircraft on their hangar decks in the dangerous condition that doctrine tried to minimize. The timing was not the result of superior American planning or execution, but rather the accidental coordination achieved when delayed dive bombers arrived simultaneously with torpedo squadrons that had attacked independently. Commander Genda, watching from Akagi's bridge as his carrier burned, understood immediately that Japanese carrier power in the Pacific had been fundamentally compromised. The destruction of 3 fleet carriers in 5 minutes represented a loss that Japanese industrial capacity could not replace for years. The Kido Butai, which had operated with overwhelming superiority for 6 months, had been reduced to a single operational carrier in the time it took to complete one attack wave. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been positioned slightly apart from the main formation and escaped the initial dive bombing attacks. Her captain immediately began launching retaliatory strikes against the American carriers, understanding that Japanese fortunes in this battle depended on destroying American flight decks before they could launch additional attacks. Hiryu's aircraft achieved hits on Yorktown, severely damaging the American carrier, but could not prevent the final destruction of Japanese carrier power. Later that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu and achieved 4 direct hits that left her burning as uncontrollably as her sister ships. By evening of June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sinking or abandoned, their crews evacuated to screening vessels. The carrier striking force that had dominated Pacific naval operations since December had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The 11 minutes between 06:49 hours, when the first reconnaissance report of American carriers reached Nagumo, and 0700 hours, when Enterprise began launching her strike force, had proven decisive. In that brief window, Japanese carriers had faced an impossible choice between launching immediate strikes with improperly armed aircraft or taking the time to rearm for anti-ship operations, while American carriers launched first. The decision to rearm, mandated by doctrine that emphasized coordinated strikes with appropriate weapons, had placed Japanese carriers in the exact vulnerable condition that American attacks exploited. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched the destruction of the Japanese carriers from his position, floating among the wreckage of his squadron. He had witnessed both the devastating effectiveness of Japanese defenses against torpedo attacks and the catastrophic vulnerability of carriers caught with armed aircraft on their hangar decks. The contrasts would define his understanding of the battle, the tremendous courage of torpedo crews flying obsolete aircraft into overwhelming defensive fire, and the decisive impact of dive bombers that arrived at the perfect moment to exploit Japanese vulnerability. The tactical lessons from Midway would reshape American carrier doctrine for the remainder of the war. The sacrifice of torpedo squadrons, while achieving no direct hits, had proven essential to the success of dive bomber attacks by drawing Japanese defensive resources to low altitude at the critical moment. Future operations would better coordinate these attacks through improved communications and tactical planning, but the basic principle remained constant. Carriers were most vulnerable when their hangar decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, and attacks that arrived during this condition could achieve devastating results. Japanese carrier doctrine would also evolve in response to the Midway disaster, implementing procedures for more rapid combat air patrol rotation and defensive positioning that minimized vulnerability during rearming operations. But these improvements could not change the fundamental reality that Midway had revealed. Carrier warfare rewarded the side that struck first with coordinated attacks against vulnerable targets, and the material advantages that American industrial capacity would provide in the war's later years would make such first strikes increasingly decisive. The sun set over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, illuminating columns of smoke that rose from 4 burning Japanese carriers. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force from Enterprise, faced decisions that would determine whether the tactical victory achieved during the day would translate into strategic success. His carriers had expended most of their aircraft and ordnance in the strikes that destroyed Nagumo's fleet. Remaining Japanese surface forces, including battleships and cruisers, still possessed formidable firepower that could threaten American carriers if Spruance pursued too aggressively. The cautious approach that Spruance adopted reflected lessons learned from 6 months of Pacific warfare. American carriers represented irreplaceable assets that could not be risked in surface engagements against superior Japanese naval gunfire. The 3 carriers that had won the Battle of Midway constituted nearly half of America's total carrier strength in the Pacific. Losing even one to a nighttime surface action would compromise the strategic position that the day's victory had established. Japanese commanders faced their own agonizing assessments as darkness fell. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, transferred to a cruiser after Akagi became uninhabitable, confronted the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his command. 4 fleet carriers sunk or sinking, more than 250 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 3,000 naval personnel killed or missing. The Kido Butai, which had operated with impunity across the Pacific for 6 months, had been effectively annihilated in a single day. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership exceeded even the material losses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship battleship Yamato, had designed the Midway operation to draw American carriers into a decisive battle where Japanese numerical superiority would achieve the crushing victory that had eluded him at Pearl Harbor. Instead, American carriers had achieved tactical surprise, struck during the precise window of Japanese vulnerability, and withdrawn before Japanese surface forces could bring their superior firepower to bear. Yamamoto ordered the remaining Japanese forces to withdraw, recognizing that continuing the Midway operation without carrier air support would expose his surface fleet to devastating American air attacks. The decision to retreat marked a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking. For 6 months, the combined fleet had operated with the confidence that came from unbroken victory and technological superiority. The defeat at Midway demonstrated that American forces had adapted their tactics, improved their coordination, and developed the capability to defeat Japanese carrier operations under conditions that should have favored the more experienced Japanese fleet. Commander Wade McCluskey returned to Enterprise as darkness fell, his SBD Dauntless showing the scars of anti-aircraft fire but still airworthy. The debriefing that followed lasted well into the night as intelligence officers compiled pilot reports into a comprehensive assessment of the day's action. McCluskey's navigation decisions, particularly his choice to continue searching beyond the estimated enemy position rather than turning back when the Japanese carriers were not found at their expected location, had proven decisive. His persistence had placed American dive bombers in position to attack at the exact moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. Lieutenant Richard Best, physically exhausted from the stress of combat flying and the physiological demands of dive bombing, provided detailed accounts of his attacks on Akagi. His 3 bomb hits on the Japanese flagship had triggered the catastrophic fires that destroyed the carrier, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of armor-piercing bombs against carriers with armed aircraft on their hangar decks. Best's tactical report would become required reading in Navy flight schools, analyzed for the lessons it provided about dive bombing accuracy and the importance of strike timing. The material consequences of the battle became clearer as reconnaissance flights over the following days confirmed the destruction of all 4 Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had all sunk, taking with them not just the ships themselves, but the accumulated expertise of their air groups and the institutional knowledge that had made the Kido Butai the most effective carrier striking force in the world. Japanese naval aviation had lost approximately 120 experienced pilots, aircrew, whose training and combat experience could not be quickly replaced. American losses, while significant, proved far less crippling to future operations. Yorktown had been damaged by Japanese counterstrikes and would later be sunk by a Japanese submarine, but Enterprise and Hornet remained operational. The torpedo squadrons had suffered devastating casualties, with 41 of 51 torpedo bombers lost and more than 80 aircrew killed. These losses represented nearly the entire torpedo striking capability of the American carrier force, but the surviving pilots and the lessons learned from their sacrifice would inform future doctrine development. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japanese carrier construction programs could not replace the 4 lost fleet carriers for at least 2 years, creating a window of American naval superiority that would prove decisive in the campaigns for Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. The industrial capacity that would eventually overwhelm Japanese resistance was beginning to mobilize, with American shipyards starting construction on the Essex-class carriers that would form the backbone of the Pacific Fleet in the war's later years. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, received the battle reports with a satisfaction tempered by understanding of the larger strategic context. The victory at Midway had eliminated the immediate threat to Hawaii and the American West Coast, but Japanese forces still occupied vast territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Defeating the Kido Butai was a necessary condition for eventual American victory, but not sufficient by itself to force Japanese capitulation. The intelligence breakthrough that had enabled the Midway victory represented a strategic advantage that would persist throughout the war. American cryptographers continued breaking Japanese naval codes, providing fleet commanders with information about enemy intentions and dispositions that shaped operational planning at every level. The ability to position American forces to intercept Japanese operations gave Nimitz and his subordinates the initiative in choosing when and where to engage enemy forces. Commander John Waldron's decision to deviate from the planned strike route, following his tactical intuition rather than the coordinated attack plan, became the subject of extensive analysis in the months following the battle. His squadron had been completely destroyed without achieving any torpedo hits, but their attack had drawn Japanese defensive resources to low altitude at the critical moment when McCluskey's dive bombers arrived, overhead. The question of whether Waldron's sacrifice had been necessary, or whether better coordination might have achieved similar results without such devastating losses, would influence carrier doctrine development for years to come. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Gay, rescued by a Navy patrol aircraft 2 days after the battle, provided the only American eyewitness account of the complete destruction of Torpedo Squadron 8. His testimony documented both the courage of pilots who pressed their attacks despite overwhelming defensive fire and the tactical impossibility of torpedo attacks by unescorted, obsolete aircraft against alerted Japanese carriers. Gay's survival became symbolic of the broader American experience at Midway, enormous sacrifice by torpedo crews whose attacks enabled the dive bomber success that won the battle. The Japanese naval leadership struggled to comprehend how a carefully planned operation, executed by the most experienced carrier force in the world, had resulted in catastrophic defeat. Post-battle analysis identified multiple contributing factors. The decision to rearm aircraft for a second strike on Midway, rather than launching immediately against American carriers, the failure of reconnaissance aircraft to locate the American task force earlier, and the coordination of American attacks that arrived during the brief window when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. But deeper analysis revealed more troubling implications. Japanese carrier doctrine, perfected through years of training and validated by 6 months of unbroken victories, had proven vulnerable to American tactics that exploited the inherent risks of carrier operations. The requirement to arm and fuel aircraft on hangar decks created periods of extreme vulnerability that no amount of defensive preparation could completely eliminate. American attacks had not succeeded through superior execution or better equipment, but through the fortunate timing that placed their strikes during one of these vulnerable windows. The industrial disparities between American and Japanese war production capabilities, which would become overwhelmingly apparent in the war's later years, were already emerging in mid-1942. American shipyards had launched Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet in the late 1930s, but by June of 1942, they were already building the next generation of carriers that would enter service in 1943 and 1944. Japanese shipyards, operating with more limited industrial capacity and resources, could not match this construction pace. The aircraft production differential was even more dramatic. American factories produced approximately 15,000 military aircraft in 1942, a number that would increase to over 85,000 by 1944. Japanese production peaked at approximately 28,000 aircraft in 1944, constrained by limited raw materials, manufacturing capacity, and the increasing effectiveness of American submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. The pilot training programs showed similar disparities, with American flight schools producing thousands of adequately trained aviators, while Japanese programs, emphasizing quality over quantity, could not replace the experienced pilots lost at Midway and subsequent battles. Commander Eugene Lindsey did not survive to see how the tactics his squadron had helped pioneer would evolve in the war's later years. He was killed during the torpedo attack on the Japanese carriers, posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership during the engagement. His sacrifice, and that of his squadron mates, represented the human cost of tactical innovation under combat conditions. The lessons learned from their attacks would inform the development of new torpedo bombers, better coordination between strike elements, and improved defensive armament that reduced the vulnerability of low-altitude attackers. The Battle of Midway marked the last occasion when Japanese and American carrier forces would meet on roughly equal terms. Every subsequent carrier engagement would occur with American numerical superiority in both ships and aircraft, advantages that grew progressively larger as American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. The Essex-class carriers that began entering service in 1943 displaced 27,000 tons, carried air groups of over 90 aircraft, and incorporated lessons learned from Midway about damage control, defensive armament, and flight deck operations. Japanese attempts to replace their carrier losses faced multiple constraints that reflected broader industrial and strategic limitations. The carriers Taiho and Shinano, laid down in 1943, represented sophisticated designs that incorporated advanced features, including armored flight decks and improved damage control systems. Construction proceeded slowly due to material shortages and competing demands from other naval programs. By the time these carriers entered service in 1944, American carrier task forces operated with such overwhelming superiority that individual Japanese ships could not significantly influence the strategic balance. The 11 minutes that had defined the tactical situation at Midway, from 0649, when reconnaissance reports forced Nagumo to confront the presence of American carriers, to 0700, when Enterprise began launching her strike, had proven decisive not through American planning but through the cumulative effect of Japanese decisions made under pressure. The choice to rearm aircraft for anti-ship operations, rather than launching immediately with ground attack weapons, the time required to complete rearming procedures, and the coordination challenges of managing combat air patrol during intensive operations had created the vulnerability that American strikes exploited. Admiral Spruance's decision to launch strikes at 0700 hours, while dictated primarily by the need to attack before Japanese carriers could launch their own strikes, had placed American aircraft in position to arrive during the critical window of Japanese vulnerability. The timing was not the result of detailed intelligence about Japanese rearming procedures or brilliant tactical calculation, but rather the natural consequence of both carriers maneuvering to strike first. The side that launched first, in this case the Americans, gained the advantage of catching the enemy with armed and fueled aircraft on their hangar decks. The transformation of American naval aviation doctrine following Midway reflected both the lessons learned from the battle and the broader evolution of carrier warfare throughout the Pacific campaign. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, whose obsolescence had been tragically demonstrated by the loss of 41 aircraft out of 51 committed to the attack, were rapidly replaced by the TBF Avenger, a newer design with better performance, defensive armament, and survivability. The new torpedo bombers entered service in late 1942 and would prove far more effective in subsequent operations. Fighter escort doctrine was revised to ensure that torpedo squadrons received adequate protection during their vulnerable attack approaches. The complete destruction of Torpedo Squadron 8, attacking without fighter cover against alerted Japanese defenses, demonstrated that unescorted torpedo bombers faced prohibitive loss rates regardless of pilot skill or determination. Future strikes allocated fighter resources to escort torpedo attacks, accepting the reduction in combat air patrol strength over friendly carriers as necessary to protect attacking aircraft. Coordination between dive bombers and torpedo bombers improved through better communications equipment, more realistic training, exercises, and tactical planning that emphasized timing over rigid adherence to predetermined strike plans. The accidental coordination at Midway, where delayed dive bombers arrived simultaneously with independently attacking torpedo squadrons, provided a model that doctrine tried to replicate through deliberate planning. The goal remained constant: multiple attack types arriving simultaneously to overwhelm defensive capabilities and exploit the vulnerability of carriers with aircraft on their hangar decks. Japanese naval aviation doctrine underwent equally significant revisions, though constrained by the material and training limitations that would increasingly characterize Japanese operations as the war progressed. Combat air patrol procedures were modified to maintain more fighters at altitude during critical operations, reducing the vulnerability to high-altitude dive bomber attacks that had proven so devastating at Midway. Rearming procedures were streamlined to minimize the time when carriers held armed and fueled aircraft on hangar decks, though the fundamental vulnerability could not be eliminated entirely. The psychological impact of Midway on Japanese naval aviators proved as significant as the material losses. The Kido Butai's air groups had operated with the confidence that came from 6 months of unbroken victory, facing enemies who seemed incapable of mounting effective resistance. The destruction of 4 fleet carriers in a single day shattered this confidence, replacing it with the recognition that American forces had adapted their tactics and developed capabilities that could defeat even the most experienced Japanese formations. The strategic initiative in the Pacific shifted decisively to American forces following Midway. Japanese operations became increasingly defensive, focused on holding existing positions rather than expanding the perimeter of conquered territory. The planned invasions of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were abandoned as Japanese commanders recognized that their reduced carrier strength could not support offensive operations against American forces that now enjoyed numerical superiority. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning just 2 months after Midway, demonstrated how the carrier balance had shifted. American forces initiated offensive operations with the confidence that their carrier task forces could provide air support and interdict Japanese reinforcement efforts. The naval battles around Guadalcanal, while costly to both sides, consistently favored American forces that could replace losses more rapidly and operate with the tactical flexibility that came from secure communications and reliable intelligence. Commander Wade McCluskey, promoted and assigned to staff positions following his leadership at Midway, participated in the doctrinal reviews that codified lessons learned from the battle. His navigation decisions, tactical judgment, and strike coordination became case studies in carrier warfare, demonstrating the importance of aggressive leadership and tactical flexibility under combat conditions. McCluskey's willingness to continue searching beyond the estimated enemy position risking fuel exhaustion and coordinated strike dissolution, had proven decisive in locating and attacking the Japanese carriers. The material costs of Midway, measured in ships sunk and aircraft destroyed, represented only the most visible aspects of the battle's significance. The institutional knowledge lost with the destruction of the Kido Butai's experienced air groups could not be quantified in simple numerical terms. Japanese naval aviation had invested years in training the pilots and aircrew who flew from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their combat experience, accumulated through operations from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, represented expertise that training programs could not quickly replicate. American losses, while significant, occurred in a context where replacement pilots were entering the fleet in increasing numbers, and where tactical lessons could be incorporated into training programs that produced thousands of new aviators. The sacrifice of torpedo squadron pilots at Midway informed training curricula that taught their successors how to conduct coordinated attacks with better fighter escort and improved weapons. The institutional learning process that transformed tragic losses into improved capabilities characterized American military effectiveness throughout the war. The 11 minutes between the first reconnaissance report of American carriers and the beginning of Enterprise's strike launch had contained decision points that shaped the battle's outcome. Japanese commanders, confronted with the unexpected presence of American carriers within striking range, had made choices dictated by doctrine and training. The decision to rearm aircraft for anti-ship operations reflected standard procedure and tactical wisdom, but it created the vulnerability that American attacks exploited. Alternative decisions, such as launching immediate strikes with ground attack weapons or dividing forces to conduct both midway strikes and anti-carrier operations, might have produced different results, but such alternatives contradicted the doctrinal emphasis on concentrated, coordinated strikes with appropriate weapons. American commanders, operating with the advantage of intelligence that confirmed Japanese intentions and composition, had positioned their carriers to launch strikes at dawn, achieving surprise that Japanese reconnaissance efforts failed to detect until too late. The tactical execution that followed, while imperfect and costly, succeeded in achieving coordinated attacks during the critical window of Japanese vulnerability. The success owed as much to Japanese decision-making under pressure as to American tactical excellence, demonstrating that carrier warfare rewarded the side that forced opponents into impossible choices between bad alternatives. The strategic narrative of World War II in the Pacific often emphasizes American industrial superiority and the inevitable triumph that material advantages made possible. But in June of 1942, such advantages remained potential rather than actual. American shipyards and aircraft factories were still mobilizing, their full production capacity not yet realized. Japanese forces maintained numerical superiority in most categories of military equipment and controlled vast territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The outcome of the war remained uncertain, dependent on battles like Midway that would determine whether American forces could seize the initiative and maintain offensive pressure. The victory at Midway provided the breathing space that American industrial mobilization required to reach full effectiveness. The 6 months between Midway and the American offensive at Guadalcanal allowed carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots to arrive in sufficient numbers to support sustained operations. The Essex-class carriers launching in 1943 would enter a Pacific theater where American forces held the initiative and operated with confidence based on proven tactical superiority over Japanese naval aviation. Japanese attempts to regain the strategic initiative, including the major carrier operations at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, would face American task forces operating with such overwhelming numerical superiority that individual tactical decisions mattered less than the cumulative weight of American industrial production. The replacement carriers, aircraft, and pilots that Japan fielded in the war's later years could not match the quality of those lost at Midway, while American replacements consistently improved in quality as well as quantity. The human stories that emerged from Midway, from Ensign Gay's improbable survival to Commander Waldron's prophetic final letter predicting his squadron's fate, provided the personal dimension that statistics and strategic analysis could not fully capture. Each of the more than 300 American aircrew who participated in the strikes against the Japanese carriers had made individual decisions about courage, duty, and sacrifice that collectively determined the battle's outcome. Their willingness to press attacks despite overwhelming defensive fire, to maintain formation discipline under conditions that made survival unlikely, and to execute tactical plans that doctrine had prescribed, but combat conditions had made almost impossibly difficult, represented the human factor that shaped historical outcomes. The Japanese sailors and aviators who died at Midway had demonstrated similar courage and professionalism, executing their duties with the discipline that characterized the Imperial Navy throughout the war. Their defeat resulted not from lack of skill or determination, but from the tactical situation that placed them in vulnerable positions at the moment when American strikes arrived. The thousands of Japanese personnel who perished when their carriers sank had been casualties of strategic decisions made at levels far above their control, victims of the broader industrial and tactical contest between nations rather than individual failings. The memorial ceremonies that followed the battle, conducted aboard American carriers still operating in combat zones, recognized the sacrifices that had made victory possible. The torpedo squadron pilots, who had pressed suicidal attacks without achieving torpedo hits, were honored alongside the dive bomber crews whose accuracy had destroyed the Japanese carriers. Military effectiveness, measured in ships sunk and strategic objectives achieved, provided one metric for evaluating the battle. But the human costs, measured in lives lost and families forever changed, provided the deeper context that statistics alone could not convey. The transformation of carrier warfare that Midway represented would influence naval operations for decades beyond World War II. The fundamental vulnerabilities that the battle had exposed, particularly the catastrophic consequences of catching carriers with armed aircraft on their hangar decks, shaped carrier design and operational procedures throughout the Cold War era. Modern nuclear-powered carriers, with their enclosed hangar bays and sophisticated damage control systems, still reflected lessons learned from the fires that destroyed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in June of 1942. The tactical doctrine that emerged from Midway, emphasizing coordinated strikes by multiple aircraft types arriving simultaneously to overwhelm defensive capabilities, remained foundational to carrier aviation throughout the jet age. The specific weapons and aircraft changed as technology advanced, but the core principles of concentration, surprise, and exploitation of enemy vulnerability persisted. The 11 minutes that had defined the tactical situation at Midway demonstrated principles that transcended the specific historical circumstances, revealing fundamental truths about naval warfare that remained relevant across generations of technological change. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the battle in his final report to Washington, identified the crucial role that intelligence had played in achieving tactical surprise and strategic success. The cryptographic breakthroughs that enabled American commanders to position their forces advantageously had proven as decisive as tactical execution or material capabilities. The integration of intelligence with operational planning, demonstrated so effectively at Midway, would become standard procedure throughout the remainder of the war and into subsequent conflicts. The Battle of Midway ended Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific and established the conditions for American counteroffensives that would eventually lead to victory. But on the evening of June 4th, 1942, as the last American aircraft returned to their carriers and the burning Japanese carriers slipped beneath the waves, the strategic significance was not yet fully apparent. What was clear was that American carrier forces had proven capable of defeating the most experienced naval aviation force in the world, achieving victory through tactical innovation, industrial capacity, and the willingness of individual aircrew to press attacks despite overwhelming odds. The 11 minutes between 0649 and 0700 hours had not predetermined the battle's outcome, but they had created the conditions that made American victory possible. The Japanese decisions made during that brief window, shaped by doctrine, experience, and the immediate tactical situation, had placed their carriers in the vulnerable condition that American strikes exploited. The coordination that emerged, more through fortunate timing than deliberate planning, had achieved the timing, concentrated attack that doctrine prescribed, but combat conditions made extraordinarily difficult to execute. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.